Hi everyone, Peter here from Flow High Performance, and in this video we will cover how to continue hypertrophy training while managing an injury. First, a quick disclaimer. I am not a doctor of any form, and this is not intended to be medical advice. This video won't be attempting to diagnose or treat injury, rather this is just about how to train once an injury has already occurred. If you require specific treatment, it is best to see a medical professional. Let's now establish what exactly an injury is. Injury is a very general term that can mean many different things, but basically, for this video we will define injury as an irregular pain signal that occurs in response to a movement. What we should understand is that injury is not always directly correlated with structural damage, like a strained or torn tissue. This means trainees can experience a pain response in the absence of structural damage, or trainees can also experience an absence of pain with unknown structural damage. To demonstrate this idea, let's take a look at this study. In this study, around 1,200 adults were recruited who were all asymptomatic, meaning they reported no prevalence of back pain. The researchers simply took an MRI of their cervical spine, which is around the neck area, and assessed the structural state of the spine region. It was found that 87.6% of the subjects presented with disc bulging, despite no subjects reporting any history of pain in the region. This demonstrates the disconnect between pain and structural damage. In some cases, pain may certainly be a result of structural damage, but it is not always. For example, if a trainee strains a muscle, they have some temporary tenderness, specifically in that region, and that is clearly a result of the structural damage. In other cases, however, pain may present without noticeable structural damage. For example, general joint irritation from overuse probably doesn't have any significant structural abnormalities, but it still elicits a pain response during certain movements. Furthermore, it is out of the scope of practice of this video to even try to diagnose structural damage, so it is not really relevant anyway. Therefore, for the sake of this video, we will be referring to injury as the pain response associated with movement. So let's say a trainee has developed some sort of injury. This may be something like a muscle strain, or it could be just general joint pain from overuse. Either way, trainees should be somewhat aware of what the cause of this injury was. This could be due to poor training technique, a specific exercise, using too much load, doing too much volume, or even something that was outside of the gym. Whatever the case is, the more aware the trainee is about how the injury developed, the more likely they are to recognize what variables may irritate the injury. This will be important to consider later in this video when we discuss how variables can be manipulated to work around the injury. Now that we have explored injuries in general, let's now discuss what the goal of hypertrophy training is. Essentially, the goal of hypertrophy training is to stress the target muscle with each set. The goal is not to lift the most weight possible or to perform the most repetitions possible, it is purely to maximally fatigue the muscle fibers through resistance training. This can be done in many different ways, with different exercises, rep ranges and loads, tempos, rest periods, techniques and more. There is no single best method to maximize muscle growth, there are many different ways to achieve hypertrophy. This is because there are a range of different methods that can still stress the target muscle and provide a hypertrophy response. This is important to understand because it gives us different options to train around our injury. So before we get into how different variables can be manipulated to work around an injury, let's first consider if we should even train in the first place. In almost all cases, the answer will be yes. While traditional resistance training is not always appropriate, there is almost always something that can be done to get somewhat of a hypertrophy stimulus. There may be some cases where training a certain muscle group is not appropriate at all, such as the immediate days after an intensive surgery, but this is the minority of cases. In such a case, it is best to follow the advice from a doctor or medical professional about how to get back to a relatively functional state before getting back into resistance training. However, for minor injuries like ligament sprains, muscle strains, and general aches and pains, trainees can almost always find a way to continue training in some way by adjusting their training routine. This is because there are no mandatory ways to achieve hypertrophy, so we can try to stress the muscle in different ways to still achieve a hypertrophy response. So for trainees who have minor injuries that can still train, we will now discuss how different variables can be manipulated to work around an injury. It should be understood that the variables we will cover are just a list of general methods to help train pain-free. How we manipulate training will depend on the specific injury case and what variables tend to recreate the pain response. Trainees need to experiment to find what variables they can change, which will allow them to train with minimal discomfort. Each variable generally has a threshold at which it causes further injury or pain. So basically the process of manipulating variables is to respect these thresholds and train within such constraints. For example, let's say a trainee experiences knee pain when squatting heavy. However, there is no distinct definition of heavy, rather the pain probably presents at a particular loading range. Maybe the trainee can train pain-free at around 40% 1RM, 50% 1RM, 60% 1RM, and it is not until they reach around 70% 1RM that they start to feel some discomfort in the knee. Therefore, trainees can still train with loads lighter than 70% 1RM, but not above this for a temporary period of time. This means trainees can still get a hypertrophy response using a slightly lighter load. This same principle also applies to other variables, not just load lifted. To help trainees understand what variables should be changed, we have grouped training variables into 3 categories in order of priority. The first category should be the first variables we should seek to change, as these will have the least impact on hypertrophy outcomes. If we still can't manage the injury by manipulating these variables, then we should try some strategies from category 2, and lastly we should implement strategies from category 3 if necessary. As we move from category 1 to category 3, we are more likely to inhibit hypertrophy gains, so we should always start with the category 1 variables first. Let's now cover each category and what variables they consist of. In the first category, we have exercise selection, rep ranges and load, and tempo. These 3 variables should be the first variables to be manipulated because they are almost certainly not going to inhibit hypertrophy outcomes. If we can still train by changing these 3 variables, then our training stimulus probably won't be any less effective. The first variable we can change is exercise selection. Because hypertrophy is not exercise specific, trainees can achieve equal muscle growth using a range of different exercises for the same muscle group. If a specific exercise results in a pain response, trainees can simply change these exercises to others which can be performed pain-free. For example, if a trainee has lower back pain doing squats, hack squats or lunge variations, they may try a belt squat or leg press instead, which takes most of the load off the spine. Or if a trainee finds that a barbell bench press causes shoulder pain, they may try a dumbbell press or an incline variation. This is specific to each injury case, so trainees need to find what exercises are suitable and which ones aren't. If you can find exercises which can be performed pain-free, then this will allow trainees to stress the target muscle just as effectively, simply by changing exercises. And the second variable in this category is rep ranges and load. This is combined as one category because rep ranges and load have an inverse relationship. In other words, the heavier the load is, the less reps that can be performed, and the lighter the load is, the more reps that can be performed. Heavier loads apply greater forces on the muscles, bones, and connective tissue involved with the lift. This generally results in more irritation to the injured tissue, which is more likely to elicit a pain response. However, it is well established that hypertrophy can be equally achieved using both heavy and light loads if sets are taken close to failure. This meta-analysis concluded that hypertrophy can be equally achieved per set across a spectrum of different rep ranges and loads when sets are taken close to failure. So if trainees find that a certain load threshold tends to irritate the injury, then they can simply use a lighter load and work with a higher rep range. This will certainly stress the muscle to a similar extent as heavier loads and result in just as significant hypertrophy outcomes. And the third variable in this category is tempo. This refers to the speed or duration of each repetition. Tempo can be changed throughout different phases of the lift. This can include manipulating the eccentric, concentric, or duration of the pause for each repetition. Faster tempos are generally more stressful on the joints and connective tissue as they involve higher force requirements, generally heavier loads, and they may significantly involve the stretch shortening cycle. Therefore, trainees may find that a slower tempo reduces the pain response while a faster tempo may irritate the injury. This may be due to the slower tempo itself, or maybe because it allows trainees to lift with a lighter load compared with a faster tempo. This meta-analysis explored the effects of repetition duration on muscle growth. It was concluded that repetitions performed for a duration ranging between 0.5 to 8 seconds had no significant difference on hypertrophy outcomes when sets are taken close to failure. However, repetition durations greater than 10 seconds were found to be inferior for muscle growth. Therefore, if trainees were to slow down their tempo to alleviate pain and manage their injury, it probably won't have any real impact on muscle hypertrophy as long as tempo is not excessively slow. Furthermore, trainees may implement pause repetitions at the start or end range during certain lifts to minimize involvement of the stretch shortening cycle, which may help to alleviate the pain response. Next, we have the category 2 variables. If trainees find that changing exercises, using lighter loads, and training with a slower tempo still results in irritation to the injury, then they should try manipulating some of the category 2 variables. In this category, we have rest periods, technique, and blood flow restriction training. Changing these variables probably won't inhibit hypertrophy to any significant extent, but they may result in a very slightly less effective stimulus. For this reason, they are considered category 2 rather than category 1. Let's now cover what these are and how they can be manipulated to continue training. First is rest periods. Rest periods can be manipulated to help train around an injury indirectly. This is because rest periods will influence load lifted. So going back to the previous point about rep ranges and load, lighter loads are generally less stressful than heavier loads. Therefore, trainees can shorten rest periods as a strategy to minimize load lifted. This could potentially inhibit hypertrophy outcomes very slightly, as it limits performance on a per set basis compared with longer rest periods. This systematic review concluded that when sets are taken close to failure, there doesn't seem to be much difference when comparing different rest periods. However, they did find a slight trend in favor of longer rest periods. This suggests that while shortening rest periods are likely to make minimal difference in hypertrophy outcomes, they may be slightly inferior compared with longer rest periods. However, if it allows trainees to train pain-free, then this is obviously a net benefit. The next variable that can be manipulated is lifting technique. In some cases, the same exercise can be performed in a different way, which redistributes the stress on different tissues. This may allow trainees to limit stress on the tissue that is injured by changing how the lift is performed. This can allow trainees to continue training, although just with a slightly different technique than they may be accustomed to. This is placed in the category 2 section because there is potential that this may provide a slightly inferior hypertrophy response. If trainees need to use a technique that is not ideal to stress the target muscle, then this may not be quite as effective as the technique that they would normally use. This is unlikely to make a drastic difference, but it overall might be slightly inferior. However, if changing technique allows trainees to train pain-free, then this is obviously a net benefit. And the last variable from category 2 is blood flow restriction training. Blood flow restriction training is basically when cuffs are applied to the limbs, which limits venous blood return from the working muscles. This supposedly increases metabolite accumulation in the working muscle, which leads to faster fatigue of the muscle fibers. This allows high threshold motor units to be recruited even when using very light loads. This meta-analysis analyzed the research comparing the effects of blood flow restriction training with traditional heavier load lifting on strength and muscle growth. It was concluded that strength increases are superior from using traditional heavier loads, although blood flow restriction training was equally as effective at promoting muscle growth. Therefore, trainees may incorporate blood flow restriction training for certain lifts as a way to use lighter loads and place less stress on the injured area. However, blood flow restriction can only really be used on the limbs and not on the trunk. This means that it may not be suitable for all lifts, especially those which train the chest, back, shoulders, glutes, or abs. However, it can certainly be a good option to alleviate pain during any bicep, tricep, quad, hamstring, or calf training. Because this is not universally applicable to all exercises and muscle groups, it has been placed in category 2 rather than category 1. And the last group of variables that can be manipulated are category 3. If manipulating variables from the previous 2 categories was still not allowing the trainee to lift around their injury, then this next list of variables should be altered. In this category, we have range of motion, proximity to failure, and volume. These variables will most likely limit the hypertrophy response, which is why they are considered the last resort. Let's now cover what these are and how they can be manipulated to allow trainees to continue training around an injury. First is range of motion. Generally, an injury will be most irritated at longer ranges of motion, or only at specific ranges of motion. This may be because the particular injured tissue is stretched as range of motion increases, or certain portions of the lift place more stress on the injured region. Whatever the case, limiting range of motion to either avoid a certain portion or to limit stretch on the tissue may allow trainees to alleviate pain while training. Trainees can simply train through the range of motion that they feel comfortable training through and still stress the muscle enough to achieve a significant hypertrophy response. However, full range of motion training seems to be more effective for promoting muscle growth than partial range. This meta-analysis explored the effects of range of motion on muscle development during resistance training. It was concluded that the response to different ranges of motion may be muscle or exercise specific, but the majority of studies found superior muscle growth using full range of motion compared with partial range. Therefore, if range of motion is limited to training around an injury, it will likely result in slightly inferior muscle growth. So if trainees need to implement this strategy to train around an injury, they should try to increase range of motion over time as the pain response allows, until they are finally back to training with full range of motion. The second variable for this category is proximity to failure. This refers to how close a set is taken to failure, usually quantified using RPE or the reps in reserve scale. As a set is taken closer to failure, the contractile tissues experience more stress. While we want to stress the muscle by taking sets close to failure, it may also increase irritation of a specific injury. Therefore, trainees can limit how close a set is taken before failure to minimize stress on the injury while still achieving a decent hypertrophy stimulus. While sets probably don't need to be taken to complete failure all the time, we need to take sets fairly close to failure to ensure all muscle fibers are recruited and trained. How close we train to failure also depends on the load and rep ranges used. Lighter loads need to be taken closer to failure to ensure all motor units are recruited and trained, while heavier loads will recruit all motor units earlier in the set. Overall, training closer to failure is probably slightly more hypertrophic when we look at raw changes in muscle size. This meta-analysis analysed all the research on training to failure versus not to failure. While hypertrophy can certainly be achieved without training to failure, there was a slight benefit when training to failure with all other factors being equal. Therefore, if trainees have to train slightly further from failure to manage their injury, it may have slightly detrimental effects on the hypertrophy response. Trainees should try to train as close to failure as possible without experiencing a pain response. They can then gradually increase proximity to failure over time as the pain response allows. And the last variable that we can manipulate is volume. This refers to the number of sets performed per muscle group per week. Volume is essentially the dosage of training, or how much we do. There is a limit to how much volume each tissue can handle before experiencing negative effects. In fact, your injury may have developed by doing too much volume in the first place. Regardless, the injured tissue will only be able to handle so much volume before experiencing a pain response. This is specific to the movements that involve that tissue. For example, if a trainee's knee is injured, then the volume of lower body movements may need to be limited, but most upper body lifts probably won't have any impact. However, it is clear that volume has a significant influence on hypertrophy too. This meta-analysis evaluated the research exploring the effects of volume on muscle growth. It was found that there was a dose-response relationship between volume and hypertrophy. In other words, the more volume that was performed, the more muscle growth that was seen. Therefore, if trainees need to reduce volume as a strategy to manage an injury, they should find the threshold at which this pain occurs. This is because a significant reduction in volume is likely to inhibit muscle growth. Volume reduction may be an acute intervention to temporarily train around a specific injury, or it may be a chronic change to a training program. This is because there is a finite amount of volume each tissue can handle before experiencing injury. So if a trainee has developed joint pain because of too much volume, then they may need to reduce volume as a long-term training strategy. So what practical recommendations can we conclude from all of this information? Well, firstly, if you have a severe injury, then it may be wise to seek medical attention before attempting to train around it. However, if such an injury is very mild or you have been cleared to train, then there are many different variables we can manipulate to continue growing muscle. This is because hypertrophy is non-specific, meaning it can be achieved using a range of different methods by stressing the muscle in different ways. Trainees should first start trying to manipulate the category 1 variables because these will probably have no negative impact on muscle growth. So if you can get away with making slight adjustments to these category 1 variables, then this is ideal. Then if you still can't train without irritating the injury, try manipulating the category 2 variables. These may have a slight detriment in the hypertrophy response, but probably nothing significant. And the last result would be to try and manipulate the category 3 variables. These will probably have a slight negative influence on the hypertrophy response, which is why they should be the last resort, not the first. And lastly, how training is manipulated is highly specific to each injury case. Trainees need to experiment with what variables seem to irritate the injury and what thresholds can be handled. Trainees should respect these thresholds and continue training within such constraints. Thanks for watching, and hopefully you got something out of this video. Remember to subscribe if you haven't already.